Hello, everybody, and welcome to this session. It's great to be able to introduce Philipp Staab today to today's Digit debate. Philipp is the professor for the Sociology for the Future of Work at the Humboldt University in Berlin, and also associated with the Einstein Center on Digital Futures there. He wrote a book in 2019 called Digitaler Kapitalismus, with the English version appearing, I think, early next year with Manchester University Press. And was awarded the Matthofer Prize for Critical Economic Studies for that book. And the leading German weekly paper, Die Zeit, recently listed him as one of 12 leading German intellectuals whose thinking matters now. He's published many other books and studies, including his new book on the adaptive society with the prestigious publisher Suhrkamp, which I think should also come out in English sometime, hopefully next year. Philipp's talk today is titled Counter-hegemonic Neoliberalism, Making Sense of EU Platform Regulation and Continental Europe's Path Through Digital. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Philipp to share his slides and to share his ideas too. So over to you, Philipp.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and also for the invitation. Very happy to be here. Yeah, exactly. Steve already told you the title of my presentation. And first of all, to make sense of the title, let me tell you about the two things I want to do today. If the slide starts moving, yeah, here we go. So basically, I want to do two things. First of all, I want to give a presentation of the basic points of my theory of digital capitalism, which will indeed soon appear. You can see the cover in red here with Manchester University Press in English as well. I put a flyer to the book with a discount code in the chat if that's interesting to anybody. But I also want to combine that with an empirical analysis of EU platform regulation, which is not essentially part of the book or what the book is essentially about, but something that comes out of the theoretical work I've done within the book, and which I thought might be interesting to some of you, at least, who are working very closely, who are already experts in terms of the digital transformation, digital technologies, the way it affects economic processes and labor. And you might be interested, well, nowadays, from the outside looking in, into what is happening within the EU in terms of especially platform regulation, as this is obviously something that has caught a lot of buzz, but no one really knows yet how to make much sense of it or what it will mean for the future. Okay, let me start with a rather bold point. No one today knows anymore what neoliberalism is supposed to mean. At least that's the impression that I have. We all know that globalization has been challenged for probably almost a decade now. The WTO, as one of the main features of global neoliberalism, has been marginalized, or the free trade system has been marginalized. On the other hand, developmental states and industrial policies are on the rise in several nations worldwide, and protective statism is on full display. Not least within the EU in terms of, for example, carbon border adjustment taxes and so on. So one might be able to ask what is left of neoliberalism beside some smoking ruins. In order to ask that question, and I promise it'll lead to the main topic of platform regulation within the EU, one of course might have to say a few words about what neoliberalism, the term, might actually describe in the type of environment that I'll be talking about. I'll use the definition or the understanding of Keen Birch, who basically argues that the essential legacy of neoliberalism is to approach society like it is a market. If you think about how to use that definition in operational sense, so where would you be able to observe neoliberal practice, then it would probably come down to the whole set of practices of what we've been come used to call market design, right? So wherever there's a market design approach to societal problems, you would say this is the type of approach that you connect to neoliberal practice. Contemporary neoliberal practice follows the conception of markets advanced by Posner. Richard Posner, Keen Birch writes, quoting, markets are designed and organized through bureaucratic and other means, whether public or private institutions. One might think within the EU of the whole single market program, of the mobile industry and other market design features of the past. Taking this definition, I want to put forward two arguments today. The first one is that the EU's trajectory through the digital transition is actually essentially about market design. This is basically, if we think about how to frame the EU's path through digital transition, we have to acknowledge that this is the main focal point. And this does come with certain implications. In particular, this approach systematically limits the political potential of digital governance of markets. For example, for other democratically agreed upon goals, like say the sustainability and green transition within the EU. Okay, now if we approach the question of technology and the digital transition within the EU a little closer, there has been some talk of the European tech clash that you might remember. Actually, it was a UK-based newspaper that started that debate. The whole term tech clash comes from The Economist originally, as far as I know. But Europe has always been on the forefront, regulation-wise, when it comes to the actual policy of what has been dubbed the tech clash. And it has done so under a particular umbrella term, at least within the von der Leyen Commission, which used the term twin transition increasingly in recent years, addressing that what it wants to do is actually to bring together the digital transition and an ecological or green transition within a joint body of politics. Okay, so this was the claim they did, which obviously didn't go very far, but still one has to acknowledge that those two aspects are supposed to be mutually inclusive, supportive of each other, and so on, within the policy framework that the EU has tried to develop in recent years. It has done so coming out of a particular political and economical situation that one could describe as a decade, or almost 1.5 decades now, of great turbulence, starting with the great financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and the European debt crisis, which followed, which resulted, as we all know, in sluggish growth that was then worsened by the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and so on, and which saw on the field of sort of social politics, also growing inequality and much more tension within the framework of liberal democracy, which this tension usually, you know, it evolves around those polar opposites of the EU being this technocratic project versus a new type of so-called populism from the left, but increasingly and more dominantly, of course, from the right. Which leads then to this crisis of liberal democracy. Within this situation of a prolonged type of economic, social, and political crisis within the European Union, there was what emerged was a particular longing, one could say, a longing for a progressive project, political solutions for progressive transformation. And the main areas, especially the Commission, but also the Parliament and so on, targeted as a result in order to create this sort of progressive policy approach, or what they perceive as a progressive policy approach, was to couple digital and green into a new policy agenda. I'll talk mostly about the digital aspect of things today, but at the end, basically, we'll get back to the question on how this actually intersects with the green project, the green transition project that the EU has given itself as well. And of course, I'd also be happy to have a hands-on discussion about that later on when the presentation is done. If we look at the digital strategies that the EU has developed since, one has to mention, first of all, that there's sort of a general agreement within Europe that the EU is perceiving itself rightly as a laggard in digital innovation, that it is highly dependent on foreign digital corporations, in consumer-facing services in particular, but also in traditional manufacturing, where, say, Volkswagen runs its IT systems on AWS and those sort of things. And as I guess you are well aware of, this buzzword of digital sovereignty evolved in that context as a stated goal in order to gain back some ground within the digital sphere in terms of innovation, but also in terms of reducing the dependency on foreign and digital corporations. In particular, of course, the big ones like the big tech companies like Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, or Meta, Amazon, and so on. In this context, platform regulation has emerged as the poster child of a policy effort claiming to be critical towards private power, because it is always targeted against big tech companies. This is the way it is framed publicly and politically. And it is happening within the digital economy. When I talk about platform regulation, I'll get to that in a minute, but just sort of right now as well, I'm talking about this whole phalanx of policies, in particular, the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, the Digital Governance Act, and the Data Act, the Platform Work Initiative, or we'll get to that later, might be considered part of it as well. But just to say, I'm not talking only about the DMA, for example, I'm talking about this as a joint effort, which it is actually intended to be from the side of policymakers. So EU platform regulation, I already said it, DMA, DSA, Data Act, Data Governance Act in particular. It doesn't come from a vacuum, right? It builds on an institutional path dependency, a particular political legacy of a regulatory market design within the EU that we've basically come to identify the EU with in many regards. Its major focal point, of course, being the project of the common single market, but also if you think about what happened in the early 2000s, or might even have been in the 1990s already, with the de- and re-regulation of the telecommunications industry, from public monopolies to privatization. If you think at very current legislation like the European, or if you think at older green legislation like the European emission trading scheme, but also about newer offsprings of that scheme, in particular the border adjustment mechanisms, the CO2 border adjustment mechanisms for steel and cement and other products upcoming. Then what you really see is that the approach to basically all sorts of macro level economic problems has been a macro level type of political market design. This is the default approach within the EU. And as I will argue, it is exactly what we see now within the realm of platform regulation. So it is the way how we have to frame and understand DMA, DSA, Data Act, Data Governance Act, and also other upcoming legislation, most probably at least. Now we come to this part where I tell you a little bit about how I would personally frame this conflict, which dimensions I pick in order to come to the conclusions that I already teased a little bit, but will say more about in about 10 minutes probably. So this is now basically my theory of digital capitalism that I published a couple of years ago in German, that will now come out with Manchester University Press in a few weeks. I think one needs to have a certain understanding of what the type of framework and production system that this type of platform regulation is up against in order to capture its whole implications. And this is what I want to give a brief presentation about. So, of course, in recent years, we've seen a growing awareness about particular things considered in conflict with liberal democracy, liberal market economies, that's probably a better term, coming out of the tech sector. So there has been a growing awareness about the fact that certain meta platforms like Alphabet, Apple, Amazon, or Meta are actually the command and control posts of the digital economy. When I wrote this book, this wasn't such a common point. It is now, not due to the book, but due to other books probably, and also other types of research. It is also kind of commonplace nowadays that these companies have been and still are highly expansive, and that they have created, not sure this is such a commonly shared point, that they have created a unique model of accumulation that I want to say a few words about. The model of accumulation they have created is one that is based, and I mean this very literally, on the privatization, or the better term would actually be propertization of entire markets. So if you think about those platform behemoths that I was just talking about, and if you want to put it in a picture, I'd say roughly this is it, okay? So those companies, they are not very well perceived as sort of classical companies operating within markets. They are more like markets on which other companies operate. This is what I mean when I say that they are proprietary markets that also have, through this expansive dynamic that we've seen since the early 2000s, developed from area-specific marketplaces, like say Google Search or Amazon as a bookseller, to really catch all markets. Sometimes in literature, people refer to this situation by describing them as socio-technical ecosystems, for example. So also there, I'm not the only one pointing that out. But they're doing it, if you just look at the market relations they create because they own, or so to speak, are the markets themselves. What you see is that they grow through the subsidization of consumption. Very common point also already, we do not really pay a fair amount of money for our Uber rides, or Google Maps is entirely for free, and so on. This is all subsidization of consumption. And if you look at the flows of economic profits, then the source, once this whole venture capital sponsored episode is over, for these companies, the source of this type of profit has really been the logic of extraction that they put in place, not with consumers, which is where, for example, Shoshana Zuboff and much of the data economy literature puts the focal point. They take data from consumers. This is how they make money. Yes, but they use this data in order to shape the access options of producers to the markets that they are themselves. And this is what they actually price in terms of money, not in terms of data, in terms of money. What they price is market participation, and they usually price it at roughly 30% of revenue, which then means nothing else that those 30% of revenues, they stay with those infrastructure providers that those platforms are, and they lack in the space of work, of labor, where they could be distributed as wages. So this is sort of, just as a footnote, the logic of social inequality that is implied within this economic model. If you think about it a little closer about how to frame this pattern of accumulation theoretically, I would argue that what we are dealing with is actually some form of privatized mercantilism. So, you know, there is this debate about techno-feudalism that started quite a bit after the initial publishing of my book. I went with the term of privatized mercantilism because what we see there is really a logic of extracting rents from trade and infrastructure monopolies, and especially the extraction of rents from trade monopolies. This is exactly what mercantilism, classical mercantilism, so the pre-liberal epoch of colonial endeavors within the global South was about. the idea within mercantilist economic theory was there is not really any profit that comes from productivity that is worth mentioning. So what we take, what we want to win, we have to take somewhere, right? This is a logic of extraction, not a logic of productivity that we would then identify with, say, industrial capitalism and so on. And they implement, those companies have implemented this economic logic of privatized mercantilism through the propertization of markets themselves. If you want to access any type of good or service through the internet, in 99% of the cases, you use your phone and you just go through one of those ecosystems. In a way, you always go through two, right? You go either through Google via Android or you go through Apple via iOS. But the point I want to stress now is that one can, of course, find a much more granular description of what those companies and similar companies that try to adapt those same strategies have been doing and are still doing in terms of economic practice. What they are doing is actually exercising something that you could call, like the stuff that the EU has been famous for, only on a macro level. They are doing on a very granular level, and they do it with means of digital technology, granular digital market design through strategies of algorithmic control. This is the program that those companies have pioneered. And in my theory of digital capitalism, I stress 4 particular strategies of algorithmic control that will, I'm pretty sure, appear kind of familiar to you because we can observe them in so many different spaces. In particular, we can observe them in any type of platform-based labor, platform-based work, which is also a field of study that is covered in its own chapter within the book. So, of course, there's data control, what Shoshana Zuboff, for example, refers to as surveillance. A thing that I would stress very strongly, that this is not only a logic covering users, it covers, or consumers, it covers producers in particular, and especially for established business models, say in manufacturing and so on. This is actually the sort of risky endeavor when manufacturing companies digitize by means of cloud providers, platform providers who are external to those same companies, which is a very interesting case for Germany. I'm not going into detail now. If you're interested in that, let's have a chat about that in the discussion later on. The second type of control that they apply is access control. So they decide who can actually take part within a market, say decide who can take part in, who can sell a particular app within the Google or the Apple App Store, who can be a third-party vendor on Amazon, under which prices those same companies can charge there, and which fees they will be charged by those market-owning companies, and in which way they have to deliver the type of service, the rules and so on that are attached to being someone within that proprietary market environment, which I refer to as performance control. So just to give you a certain idea on how you would operationalize that when you think about labor, okay? The obvious example, because it is sort of the clear-cut case of the application of those market design strategies to labor, is of course any type of platform-dependent work. But I would very strongly argue that we find this in many, many other workplaces, okay? The same type of logics. It's just that it's so obvious and clear-cut when you look at platform work. So data control, this is what is implied in tracking employees, right? Access control is something that is, for example, in those companies executed via ratings. So you have a certain rating as a worker, and this means that you can access other services. You can get a pay raise, for example, right? Where you are already in the area of price control, because prices in this area are then prices for labor. And if you have a certain rating, if you gather certain ratings and they get algorithmically translated into a particular score, say your Uber score in stars or whatever, then your compensation is very often directly based on that scoring, meaning this is the way those companies control prices, right? And of course, performance control is something we know from all the different types of labor control that have been a strong focus in the research on that field within at least a decade or so. And I won't go into detail there because I'm pretty sure you're all quite familiar with that sort of stuff. So all this is granular and actually very effective market control by means of a very granular digital market design. So zooming back into this whole question of what the EU is doing in terms of platform regulation, think about it this way. What those companies, those big tech companies have championed is a very granular type of digital market design. But this really was and still is the essential trademark of what the EU in terms of economic policy, especially in the sphere of technology, has always claimed to be its own turf, right? So what those companies have been doing, this is a direct contestation to the paradigm of EU's liberal market rationality, which is always operationalized in practices of market design. This is basically the privatization of the main policy approach of the EU within the most edgy part of innovation. Thus, I'd argue that EU platform regulation, that I'll spell out in detail a little more in a second, is actually about reestablishing this type of political supremacy over market design. So this is, it's not only that it's the default option of the EU to approach anything by means of market design, but it is also the fact that what those companies have been doing is attacking the EU's legitimatory framework really at its core, right? The single market, this is what we have. The design of markets for consumer benefits, this is what the EU has always done and what it has been proud of. And this is exactly what those companies sort of have privatized without the EU being able to stop that from happening. So recently, so what you could say is that platform regulation within the EU is the attempt to go back in the digital realm, to go back from privatized to a strategy of political market design. And we can see that recently in the European Commission publishing a whole series of legislative proposals that directly tackle platform-based market design. I already mentioned the ones that in the paper and also now in the new foreword of the book, we've covered at my professorship and quite a bit of research: the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, the Data Governance Act, the Platform Work Directive, and the European Data Act. So this is something I'll just sort of skip through rather quickly and then give you the results, because otherwise you would fall asleep, because it's not such an exciting thing to go through every detail here. Basically, what we did and why the parts where I talked about my theory of digital capitalism are not only there to tell you also about the book, but essentially about how we analyzed the EU's approach to platform regulation. What we basically did is we took those 4 control strategies. So you can see on the left here, data control, access control, price control, and performance control as the essential tools of those proprietary market companies. And we listed in the middle section what those main practices are in terms of what those companies do, where we can observe those type of practices. And then we listed in the section on the right how in particular policies under the umbrella term of platform regulation, those approaches are being challenged, forbidden, shaped in a different way, and so on. And what we see then is really that it is the particular types of data control, access control, price control, and performance control, which are at the core of what those acts try to cover and try to well, gain control over is probably the best term in order to get to reestablish a political primacy of market design within market design. So the way I use this argument is really that what we can see here then is a conflict. So if you say what is happening in terms of digital capitalism within the EU, I would say what is happening if we try to make sense of it, right? This was the promise of the title. What we see is a conflict between privatized and political market design. And this is a framing, just to say it real quickly, and maybe we can go into more depth in the discussion. And this is a framing that departs quite a bit from many of the other assumptions of what the EU is doing, like in terms of, well, they are rediscovering industrial policy, and say, well, if you look at what they really flag out as their main approach to the question of power within the digital transition, they really are, this is really what they are doing, privatized, and they try to gain back control over market design. And we see a conflict of privatized and political interests unfolding in this type of regulation. So what is happening, I would argue, is that the EU tries to tackle exactly the core strategies of privatized market design: data control, access control, price control, performance control, which are exercised by those platform behemoth companies. But it actually, this is something that the tables would show if we had taken a lot of time to go through them, but it actually sticks to blacklisting and rule setting. So this is basically what it does. It doesn't steer those companies in a particular direction. It sticks to blacklisting certain practices and setting certain boundaries, certain rules for what they can and cannot do. This is all happening if you look at the way the arguments are made within an ideational frame of market design. Thus, the conflict should be understood as a struggle between privatized and political market design, as I already mentioned. Now, I'm a big fan of using empirical research, not only in order to describe the particular phenomena that you are observing, but also in order to create certain hypotheses about how this research would actually, how this should actually be perceived in terms of supporting greater theoretical and analytical questions. And this is what I want to spend the last 5 minutes of my presentation on, and what I already put in the, what I also put in the title. So what we can see then there is, I would argue, a type of counter-hegemonic neoliberalism unfolding within the EU. And I want to make this point at the end quite sort of analytically. Political digital market design, it represents a lesson learned from the digital platforms, privatized digital market design. So it's really what the EU is doing is not the same thing that they did with the single market. It is the attempt to learn from those platforms how to design markets, but then of course not being able to do it the same way they do it, because in order to do that, you would have to socialize them, and this is not within the framework of liberal market design, obviously. But they are at least targeting exactly the strategies of algorithmic management and data-based market design that those same companies have developed. I would argue that this means that the EU's program actually reproduces the central approach of contemporary neoliberalism. Remember the definition of Keen Birch, to the governance of society in terms of market design. I admit it's not a great surprise that the EU follows the neoliberal playbook, but hope I could show it at least in a certain way. Doing so, and I think this is quite important in terms of what to make of this assumption. Doing so, it actually misses out on using platform power, market control power, and so on, for a granular and possibly ecological governance of markets, which, if I may remind you of the twin transition framework of the Commission, which is actually the stated goal of innovation and regulation policies in the digital and ecological realm within the EU. Thus, it also misses out on utilizing the digital transformation for the democratic governance of markets. This is, for me personally, I'd say politically as well, the real pity of this type of regulation that in certain other ways, and one has to say it is the most ambitious regulatory project in the digital realm that we've come across so far. And still, it has these particular and I'd say rather great limitations. So instead of using digital market control, for example, in order to create some sort of sustainability-led control and design of market, the EU actually sticks to its neoliberal trajectory. While EU platform regulation actually is the most aggressive and most move against big tech thus far, it also perpetuates the EU's neoliberal path dependency in a world that is arguably less neoliberal than ever, at least than for a long time, obviously. Last sentence, I would argue EU platform regulation represents a neoliberalism claiming to be counter-hegemonic against the hegemony of big tech corporations within the digital realm without ever leaving the confines of neoliberal thinking. Thank you very much.
Okay, fascinating. Thank you very much, Philipp.
That was exactly 40 minutes, wasn't it?
Fantastic timing, 39 and a half. So we'll forgive the rounding error. So we have about 20 minutes or so for a discussion. People fancy putting their cameras on so we can see each other. That would be good if you're comfortable. I'll take questions if you want to put your hand up or wave at the screen or type in the chat box. Whichever you like is absolutely fine. While we wait for the first questions to come in, I'd like to just briefly continue some of the discussions that we had while I was in Berlin earlier in the autumn, Philipp. I think the overall argument you present is pretty compelling, and it seems clear that there's no big no clear divergence between the EU sort of existing embedded neoliberalism, we could call it, and its policies to regulate platforms. But I do wonder a bit about the industrial policy side of things, because there you had a bit less to say in today's talk, but I know it's something you've been thinking about. So I wonder whether what are your views on industrial policy initiatives to try to build up European indigenous, in quote marks, platforms, things like, for example, CHIPS funding, Gaia-X, etc. What do you see the prospects for these industrial policy initiatives? And do you see them as being ruptures with the sort of neoliberalism of the past 25 years or so? Or do they also remain within sort of confines of this market design logic that you describe?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So first of all, for other questions, just let me quickly mention that feel free to ask anything, also in terms of what is happening in the EU in terms of this and that. Digital-wise, I'm very happy to have a broad discussion. You do not have to stick to what I just presented, as Steve basically did as well, asking about industrial policy now. So see that the main thing is really that, of course, you can do a political economy analysis with a very broad term of what digital transition might mean, and then find that platform regulation is only one piece of the puzzle and that there are so many other ones, and there's not really sort of a hierarchy between them in terms of how to understand digital capitalism analytically. But this is not what I am doing. What I'm doing is I really, within the book, I really, or my work in general, I really tried to capture core features of something breaking apart from the path dependencies, even the path dependencies of the neoliberal economic model. As I would argue that neoliberalism might, at least in certain terms, end once it has finished privatizing even the market. Right? Neoliberals need the market in order to say, well, this is where innovation comes from, this is where life chances are distributed, and so on and so on. Once this entity has turned into private property, it's really a rough question whether this would still be considered neoliberalism. You know, other people put it in the way to say, is this the capitalism? This is the techno-feudalism discussion that has developed since. In this regard, in terms of saying, well, or say my main argument for using this proprietary markets model in order to say, well, this actually is the core what I describe as digital capitalism, is that this is a particular model of concentrating power within the economy and to a certain extent within society, of course, as well. And this is not the case for many of the other parts of, say, more common digital innovation, like, I don't know, you know, if you look at the digital transition within the EU, it's many times it's about buying computers for schools in Berlin, Paris, or Romania, you know. Of course, you can say this is part of digital capitalism as well, but then this term itself isn't a very strong analytical term anymore. And now when the EU or its most powerful economy, Germany, tries to put a few dots of industrial policy in place, which are already very controversial, and I say a few words about that in a minute, this really doesn't affect the core of, you know, this whole area of platform economies and that we've been talking about. What we see in the area of AI policies and AI innovation politics and practices as well these days, it is always the same thing. You're late to the party as Germans or as Europeans. You're late to the party. Then you try to regulate and design what is already lost ground for your own companies, you know, and you try to find your niche. So what we do in the realm of AI now, for example, is there's a strong partnership, 500 million euros being invested, plus a lot of other money in a cooperation between Bosch, Lidl, you know Lidl, I guess? They are a cloud company now as well. SAP and a German AI startup that claims to have some sort of ChatGPT-like technology that is called Aleph Alpha, 50 people sitting in Heidelberg. The guy who founded this company has been shown around the EU for months now. It's the only horse in the race that we have. So what they are doing is ask me more about this if you want more about this. I just wanted to use it as an example of how industrial policy, because this was brokered by the Ministry of Economics and so on, this deal, the way industrial policy unfolds in the EU and in Germany in particular, is it tries to cover niches that are left. So you want to have some semiconductor manufacturing, right? Best case, some that is useful for German automakers in order to be a little less dependent. But it's not something that is there to build up its own globally competitive ecosystem or anything like this. The money is too little. The approach, of course, is in a way breaking with some sorts of radical market approaches. But then, you know, and this is really just for the German case, this is the crazy situation. I'm not even sure this makes the news in the UK, okay? But we just had this, just last week had this, had the highest German court claiming, rendering the household of our governing progressive coalition illegal. So all because they circumvented the so-called Schuldenbremse, right? Is that something that is familiar to you? So the German state isn't really allowed to make debts up to a certain extent. This is part of our constitution, is how we came through the great financial recession. We implemented it afterwards in order to be sort of have a stable debt-free economy. And the way the German part of the whole industrial policy approach has been supposed to be paid for was they took pandemic funding into an investment vehicle that was supposed to pay for example, for the semiconductor companies in Magdeburg and so on and so on. And this has been declared illegal by the highest German court. So the whole budget of the digital ecological modernization of the German economy, at least, it just went away. It's just not there anymore. We're talking about, I don't remember, 60 billion euros, I think, that they wanted to invest. It is just like, it's all in shambles. And this is just one of the many ways the path dependency of the European and the German model in particular make me very, very skeptical about a certain approach of industrial policy being a big change to anything. So this was a very long answer, but you know.
Fascinating. Anybody else want to ask something? I have a couple of others, but I'll give the floor to anybody else. David has his hand up, so go ahead, David.
Hello, Philippe. Hello, everybody. I found that really helpful, very clarifying on a whole set of issues that I kind of have been half understanding at best. My question is about the better version of a perhaps in your mind more genuinely counter-hegemonic form of regulation that you hint at the end. And I was scribbling notes rapidly, but a more granular economic governance of markets derived from an account of platform power, I think was part of what you were suggesting was the missed opportunity, the lost opportunity that's swept away by this kind of more neoliberal approach, which sounds really right and convincing to me. But could you just say a little bit more about what that superior model of governance might look like? What precursors there are for that? What past examples there have been of that might at least point towards that superior mode of regulation?
Sure. So yeah, great question. So the model of privatized market governance via digital platforms that I described is one that, you know, we know its means, right? It's about profit maximization. I would argue it is by extracting rents from infrastructure monopolies. So it's actually a predatory economic practice, even within capitalism. It's not a really growth model. It's a predatory model. But one can think, of course, about how to use those steering capacities of digital platforms in order to create markets that work in favor of other means. And I'd say this is what I tried to frame with this idea of, well, this was actually meant to be part of a twin transition. Well, if you want a twin transition in terms of implementing ecological goals within the design or the regulation of the economy, and platforms are the entities that actually control how the economy is run, why not implement sustainability or ecological aspects within the type of mandatory market design approaches that those platforms, I'm lacking a verb here, use what they do, right? One part of or a debate where this is being discussed and that I'm affiliated with in terms of the way this debate is with the people that run this debate within Germany, but also parts of the US and a bit in the UK as well, is a debate that evolves around the comeback of ideas of economic planning, basically. This idea of platform-based planning, they usually then, this is why I had this picture of the operations room of CyberSyn on the last slides, right? This is where this idea comes from, that you could actually have some type of cybernetic system of market, not even governance, right? It's really market control, steering capacities within with an operator that can set certain goals in order to achieve certain things by regulating and controlling markets rather granularly. This is something that has had a comeback in kind of a niche type of leftist social theory, political economy, social theory. And I think this is quite interesting. I do not think that the term planning is leading anywhere. I mean, this is something that you can use within your academic niche of leftist intellectuals, and it might help you in order to rally the troops behind an interesting. I'm all fine with that. As I said, I'm sort of part of that, but I'm also part of a framework here in Berlin, which is kind of connected to politics and talking to people who have to work in the real world, you know. And I think there are actually, and this is the point that I find much more interesting, okay? Maybe not intellectually, but politically. There are quite a few processes going on where policies have already departed on a certain path of market regulation, especially within the realm of ecological modernization and its market politics. Carbon trading being the main example, of course, but in terms of how this affects global trading and the global political economy, carbon border adjustment mechanisms. They have just started within the EU for steel and cement. And the idea of the EU policymakers is to, within the next decade, roll that out, that scheme out for everything. And I mean literally everything. This is how they want to protect. I'm not saying this is a very technocratic program, okay? But this is what they are up for. Now they do it for infant industries like green steel. So in order to create oxygen-based steel, you have to prohibit Chinese and Indian coal-based steel, which is way cheaper to enter the EU. Otherwise, you will never have green steel. This is in a way how trade policy interacts with industrial policy, Steve. Indeed, it does. So what you need to do then is you need to track the profiles of any types of products, just like those companies, big tech companies that we used to talk about, are tracking every kind of feature of every individual user or producer. You have to do that for basically any product in the market in the long run. And the way the EU is doing it right now within carbon markets, but also within the border adjustment scheme is, well, you know, every company has to report its footprint in terms of CO2 and maybe other things. There are 10 or 15 Excel sheets on the market that you can use, and you pick the best one, and then you have the one that is best for your stats, and use that, and then you put it manually into a type of an online bureaucratic thing, and you type it in. It's a lot of work. It's highly inefficient. There's no control scheme in it. No real standardization scheme. It's rolled out without proper standards, without proper control. Well, you will never be able to have proper standards or proper control if you don't run that through a politically controlled digital platform. Then you already run all the global trade within that goes into the EU through that type of a political planning entity that those leftist planning people are now discussing as a theoretical option, and thinking about this. It will happen, or the ecological modernization in that realm will not happen. These are the only two options. So I would say pragmatically, what is really interesting in terms of the digital transition in particular, maybe not so much for labor, but you could also think about how to implement labor standards in that type of surveillance of production chains and commodity chains and so on. What is really, really interesting is the stuff that is already happening and how you can use what we as researchers know and have learned about the power of digital technologies to shape markets in order to shape markets in a political way, because otherwise those political projects to shape markets will simply fail. They will. And yeah, well, this is stuff I do on a pragmatic level when I write policy papers on data governance and I talk to policymakers about that. This is, I don't sort of shove them the idea of that this is also part of a leftist discussion on planning, but I tell them that this is the only way they can run. They can do what they actually intend to do. And then, of course, there would be a secondary question whether one is optimistic that this will actually work. And I will only answer that question if you ask me.
Does anybody dare to ask that question? We have a few minutes left. Anybody else is welcome to jump in. Otherwise, I had one more thing I wanted to ask, but priority to others. Sanya, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes. Hi. Thank you so much, Philip, for the presentation. It's very interesting to hear all these ideas. I'm studying currently the Sustainable Development course at the Sussex University, and I'm doing a policy memo on the effect of misinformation and fake news that are happening a lot lately through especially like digital advertising, meta platforms, Google platforms, and so on. And there's recently also been a lot of debate about, like, for example, the usage of Twitter, how they're collecting data, and all this, the misuse of this information collected. There's also been recent developments in the policy by the EU in terms of how they want to regulate the political advertisements, especially through Facebook and Google services. But it seems like it's all just right now focusing on, okay, providing transparency, doing some controls of, like, automatic controls of which keywords are being used, which visuals are being used, but there is not really a lot of fact checking, or there is not really a lot of effort being put into somehow coming to the source of where these fake news are coming from. So a lot of fake news have been coming also from Russian propaganda against the Ukraine war. So how do you see this developing further in terms of EU regulations, and what do you think would be the best course of action?
Much of that is covered in the DSA, so in the Digital Services Act for the EU space. And I mean, what is kind of impressive about that is that while it does continue the legacy of self-regulation of social media platforms, so there's not really a break with that legacy, it also creates those oversight bodies that are supposed to then check, and it also implements duties on those platforms in order to take down certain things, fake news, etc., and rather heavy penalties if they don't. So theoretically, this is promising, but practically, the main issue really is, I'm not sure what it is with the DSA, but you have similar oversight bodies with the DMA. Last time I checked, which I admit has been a while ago, what the EU was planning with for the control of market power of the essential blacklisted companies, of the great big tech companies, so the GAFA group basically. What they planned with were 50 people. They planned in 50 additional people in order to police the digital sphere in terms of market control, which is just so silly. The German antitrust office, they have 800 operational staff. I mean, it's still way too small. Germany is a very concentrated economy, and it's just way too few people. If that's your approach, right? You want to have real markets and antitrust law and so on. So it really comes down to a question of control, not so much a question of policy, which is in many cases the case. The problem is really enforcement, and you've seen it with GDPR, for example. The fines are huge, and it created a lot of problems for a lot of companies, but not for the ones who are the main the main offenders. and it didn't create high penalties at all because there was no policing, and half of the data protection offices in the EU are in Germany, and even in Germany nothing is happening. And so legislation isn't bad, pragmatically speaking. Enforcement is.
Fantastic. Well, thanks very much. I think we had better wrap up there. It's gone 2 o'clock. So Can I say thanks very much to Philipp for the excellent presentation and for answering questions. There should be a survey on your screen. If you'd like to give us a bit of feedback about the event, that would be fantastic. I think there is also a note in the chat from Alex. We will have a new series of Digit Debates sometime in the spring, so please do follow us on X or Twitter or whatever we call it now, on LinkedIn and on our website as well. And you'll hear more about our upcoming events. But that's it for this year, for 2023. So thanks again, Philipp. Thanks everybody also who attended and participated in Digit Debates over the last few months. And we look forward to seeing you in the new year.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening and discussing.
Bye now.